The latest Pew Global Attitudes survey shows that the image of the US abroad has plunged to what are some record negatives. An atmosphere of mistrust, as we were talking about in the previous episode, doesn't help build strategic relationships, especially now when international cooperation is of more importance in combating a global pandemic. So in order to understand why the outcome of this election and its aftermath are going to be so important for us in Northern Ireland, we need to see it in the context of why it's rarely been more important for the whole world.
And Steve, just to come in there, so I've lived through this twice now. In 2008, I lived in Northern Ireland during the end of the Bush administration, where America's reputation had plunged to record lows at that time, and then I lived through the election of Obama and kind of this resurgence of hope, if you will, and then now I'm experiencing it again under the Trump administration. And I guess as an American who lives abroad, I mean, I guess I've been able to see firsthand the influence and the impact that the U.S. can have on the world, and that's obviously changed some of my views that I would have grown up with, and may do so for others that have had that experience. But so we'll actually go to the first question with Julie Norman, who's another American who lives abroad, who will explore how Trump's presidency and this election campaign, what the effects it has had on the U.S. reputation abroad.
Well, the Trump presidency certainly hasn't helped the U.S.'s reputation on the global stage, largely because of Trump's isolationist policies, but more so just because of the rhetoric and the tone that he brings to foreign policy. Just on the policy front, some might say that, George W. Bush's administration was perhaps more actually destructive in terms of foreign policy with the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War than Trump. But with that said, Trump definitely, destructive in his own way in pulling out of the Paris Agreement, his stances on climate change, as well as just undercutting international institutions like the WHO, even in the midst of the pandemic, as well as pulling out of international agreements like the Iran nuclear deal. So in terms of Trump, we've seen many of these policy decisions that were problematic in their own right, but it was more his rhetoric, his tone, and also just his unpredictability that are really dangerous on the world stage. Most allies want to see a stable, predictable U.S. leadership, one that respects diplomatic norms and respects international institutions, and want engagement from the U.S. that is, actually a positive engagement rather than the isolationism that we've seen under Trump, and definitely trying to move away from the America First framing of foreign policy, especially right now as we go into the next phase of the pandemic, hopefully by early next year, with working towards a potential vaccine, trying to have that distributed fairly and equitably across different countries, and really needing to double down on international cooperation to move us out of this global crisis. And for many governments watching from overseas, Trump has not really indicated through his messaging that would be the approach that he would take. So I think a lot of allies will be looking for someone who's a bit more conciliatory, a bit more cooperative, and overall just a bit more predictable in terms of their foreign policy decisions.
Interesting reflections from Julie there, because we've seen in the last few years maybe the US retreating from what had been its position of global influence and being the international leader of the democratic world, leader of the free world, the old cliche of the role of the US president. But then maybe in more recent years, then we've seen that vacuum being filled increasingly by the likes of Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, trying to coordinate an international response where one has been required. But arguably, even Germany can't fill that role in a lot of ways because it doesn't have the same global clout that America has traditionally had, doesn't have the same resources at its disposal to carry the same degree of influence. So it is interesting as other world leaders have to try and find their own new role in a lot of ways and the step up to this more unpredictable global order. And of course, things are already quite unpredictable because with the UK leaving the European Union, then that's one example of institutionalized cooperation retreating, and other leaders having to respond and trying to create new ways of cooperation. So maybe this is a good point whenever we can introduce our next guest, Lisa Claire Whitten, who is a PhD student at Queen's University Belfast, looking at the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland. And Lisa's also one of our writers at Northern Slant. So we'll hear some of Lisa's reflections now on Brexit and the US.
It's a testament to the craziness of 2020 that discussing Brexit can be light relief. Yet, for better and worse, Brexit is still with us. Negotiations are ongoing between the United Kingdom and European Union as to the terms of their future trading relationship. Both sides are clear in their hope to reach some form of agreement before the end of the transition period on the 31st of December 2020, after which the UK's withdrawal from the EU, Brexit, will become a reality that affects industry, consumers and citizens. By all accounts, those negotiations are not going well. Many observers and commentators are pessimistic about the prospects of a UK-EU trade agreement being reached, and if one is agreed, it will almost certainly be a minimal or thin set of arrangements. In parallel, the UK and EU are also attempting to clarify and operationalise the commitments both parties made in the UK-EU withdrawal agreement, signed in 2019 and ratified in January 2020. In these talks, most of the discussion, debate and the almighty diplomatic rows centre on the part of the agreement that deals with Northern Ireland, the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. The terms of that protocol are interpreted very differently by the two sides. A few weeks ago, this scenario resulted in an exceptional move, even by 2020 standards, on the part of the UK government, who tabled legislation, the UK Internal Market Bill, which, if passed, would enable UK ministers to disapply aspects of the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol, thereby breaking an international legal treaty that they negotiated and signed just months ago. Why does any of this matter for the US presidential election? 2 words: Irish America. In the wake of the UK government's controversial Internal Market Bill and the proposed breach of the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol, prominent Democrats and Republicans in the US raised their voice in opposition to the move and to any UK government initiative that threatens the Good Friday Agreement or the Northern Ireland peace process. It's worth remembering that the explicit purpose of the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol is to protect Northern Ireland's still in process peace and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in all its parts. And particularly to ensure that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland. So any proposal to breach the protocol is understood by politicians on both sides of the US political divide as a potential threat to peace in Northern Ireland. Following the publication of the UK government's controversial bill, US political heavyweights such as the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Chairman of the House Committee on Ways and Means, Richie Neal, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Special Envoy to Northern Ireland and previous White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and Democratic nominee Joe Biden all spoke of their unequivocal and steadfast support for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Irish peace process. This is important because, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election, negotiations on a UK-US trade deal are coming soon to a newsfeed near you. If the nature of Brexit is perceived by the powerful, bipartisan Irish lobby in the US Congress to have breached, undermined or threatened in any way the Belfast Good Friday Agreement or peace process in Northern Ireland, UK government negotiators will receive a frosty reception in Washington DC. And a UK-US trade agreement will not pass the House of Representatives if issues pertaining to Northern Ireland are not resolved. The complex and still unfolding story of Brexit, Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Protocol, UK-EU future relations, Irish America, the Irish lobby in Congress and the prospect of a UK-US trade deal all set Northern Ireland up as a kind of diplomatic barometer, not just of UK-EU relations, but also of UK-US relations. So in short, this story is far from over.
I think Lisa's spot on there to consider that Brexit is taking a back seat to anything, considering it was such a large role that it's played in our lives over the last 4 years and will continue to do so. Just shows you what 2020 has presented us with. And I think she's right. She collected all the different aspects of different countries and people that are affected by Brexit, whether that's Ireland, Northern Ireland, the future of UK-EU relations and transatlantic relationship and trade between the US and the UK, and the effects of the Irish lobby on that as well. Continuing to concentrate on the Irish lobby and the influence of the Irish American vote, I'm going to move on to Julia here, who will discuss briefly the religious elements of the U.S. election. Of course, religion has always played a big role in U.S. elections, quite differently than it does here and in other parts of the world. So Julia is going to evaluate that a little bit, and then she will introduce our next panelists.
Religion plays quite a significant role in politics in America, particularly in election time. In 2016, we saw a spotlight on the evangelical vote, but in this election, we're seeing an awful lot of conversation about the Catholic vote. Donald Trump is surrounded by quite a lot of sort of very high-profile Catholics within his administration. You've got Bill Barr, the Attorney General. You've got, although she's not there any longer, Kellyanne Conway, but she's still doing an awful lot of outreach for him in the run-up to the election. There is a huge number within his sphere, sort of, that are within the Catholic, that would be Catholic voters. But what is the connection to the Irish American lobby? And it'll be interesting just to see how this plays out, given that Joe Biden is of Irish descent. He would be the second Catholic to occupy the White House if he wins in November. The first, obviously, being President John F. Kennedy. But really, I want to introduce Ruth Foster to talk about the significance of the Irish American lobby and the Catholic vote in this election.
Okay. I'm Ruth Foster. I am a master's candidate at Harvard Divinity School, where I specialise in religion, ethics and politics. Religion has played a really significant role throughout the 2020 election for both campaigns. Of course, we see a continuation of Trump appealing to his conservative, evangelical, Protestant base through his pro-life policies, through his rhetoric, and also through his actions. If we think about his June 1st photo op outside of St. John's Church during the Black Lives Matter protests, of what message he was trying to get across there. However, we can contrast that with Biden, who's a really interesting figure when we're thinking about religion and politics in America. Of course, if he were to be elected, he'd be only the second Catholic president in America's history. And if you contrast his campaign today as an Irish Catholic American with JFK's campaign as an Irish Catholic American, there's a real difference in how they assert their Irish Catholic identities. JFK, of course, had to really downplay his Catholic identity, saying he was running primarily as an American candidate at a time when anti-Catholicism was still pretty prominent. Whereas with Biden, the Republicans are still weaponizing his Irish Catholic identity against him, but in a completely different way. In fact, at the Republican National Convention, Biden was called out for being a Catholic in name only, due to the fact that he runs on a pro-choice platform. Now, this is really significant when we think about who each side is trying to appeal to and on what grounds and what policies they're trying to appeal to them. The Catholic vote, of course, is not a monolith. It's incredibly diverse, and lots of people would argue the Catholic vote really isn't a thing. And if it were, it's more 40-40-20 than 50-50 either way. And so with Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, I think there's a really interesting shift within the Catholic population in America, especially the Irish Catholic population in America, of thinking on what grounds are they voting for each of these candidates and what policies are most important to them, especially since Amy Coney Barrett is most likely to try to reverse Roe v. Wade. Already we've seen prominent Catholic figures in America come out either side of this debate, and it's going to be really interesting to see what impact that has on the rest of the campaign. But also, this goes beyond the campaign. Of course, if we have conservative Catholic justice on the Supreme Court, and I think to a certain degree, when we're thinking about religion and politics, it's really easy to condense it down and say this is only happening to appeal to certain people during the campaign. But what we also need to do is thinking about the people who are being nominated around these candidates, who are creating the policies, creating the rhetoric, and who are going to be continuing to do this work beyond the election and into the next 4 years, and what impact that's going to have on the nation as a whole. Like Biden said, this is a fight really for the heart and soul of America. And what we really need to be thinking about, if we're thinking about the context of religion politics, is whose heart, whose soul, and whose America are they both trying to appeal to?
I think what's interesting, just to an extension of what Ruth was saying there, about sort of, Donald Trump, it's no longer just about abortion or any of those single issues like abortion or same-sex marriage. Trump is trying to frame religion at the moment around the Democrats trying to take away your ability to freely practice your faith. And it's just quite interesting to see that now play out within the Catholic community in the United States. I suppose my question, Michael, for you is the evangelical vote still facing the same challenges that it did in 2016? And, how relevant is that vote going to be in this election in 2020?
I mean, it's 100% relevant. I would say solid 85% of Trump's voting base is either from an evangelical background or would be aligned with them, at least in a political sense. Having grown up in that background, it's one of the biggest anomalies of my life, and certainly in political life. I think it's very difficult to understand if you're from outside of the evangelical background, but certainly I don't even know if we'd have a Trump if they weren't such a significant base. They don't make up the majority of the country, but they certainly are a huge voting bloc that gives, traditionally, at least over the last 30, 40 years, the Republican Party something to rely on and something to be utilized and influenced for their political gains. So, yeah, I think so. I think also on the Catholic side of things, I think this is maybe a consequence of America, both parties in America going further to the right since the 1980s, and then also single issue voters on the issue of abortion. Whereas, maybe a lot of the people wouldn't vote in an economic sense for some conservative or Republican policies because of the pro-life stance. They're sometimes just put into that vote. So hugely influential, can't be understated.
One way that the Supreme Court fight helps Trump is that it probably makes it makes the election less of a direct referendum on him and more of an ideological signpost to the direction of the country. And so I think there are a lot of people who have maybe voted for Trump in 2016, maybe having second thoughts about it now. Now that there's an ideological litmus test basically in the Supreme Court, then I think that might persuade them to fall in line and actually vote for him this time.
And it is remarkable to the many outsiders, whenever we're thinking about, more religious Christians, either evangelicals or Catholics in particular, then, that their candidate is this guy who, from everything that we've seen over the last 4 years in terms of his own personal behavior and the way he conducts himself, he hardly strikes many outsiders who've been in as someone who's going to be an obvious champion for the issues that they care about. So it's an interesting tension between kind of just setting aside those personal indiscretions or whatever you want to call them about Trump as a person, and just focusing on those issues that he's promoting on their behalf.
But with the greater good, a concept of the greater good for them, I suppose.
His agenda is more, him promoting their agenda is more important than the man's character, basically.
Yeah.
If you ask any sort of religious voter, that's what they'll tell you.
Yeah.
And it is interesting then because Joe Biden then, maybe, as Ruth was alluding to, and how he's, a different kind of, Catholic candidate really in America, that this time he is, being more open about his faith, and he seems to be making quite an effort to maybe target voters who might be on the fence if they are thinking more in terms of the character of a president. as well as the issues that they promote on their policy agenda. So that's an interesting shift. Traditionally, the Democrats have been much more secular, but maybe, in the election, we're seeing a bit more of a rebalancing there in at least some way, that he's talking more openly about his own faith and his personal values.
And I think that's especially important at a time of a pandemic or a time of national health emergency, where empathy is a really important Christian value, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And as we know, Biden seems to win that particular contest hands down.
Biden's personal story, faith goes hand in hand with his personal tragedies that he's experienced, losing 2 children and his wife. And, and I think that will play out, and that he has, certainly sort of used his faith as a way to connect with people, and sort of particularly in a year like 2020, when we've suffered through the pandemic and, the tragic consequences of that. So his faith is, it's not kind of obvious in the sense that it's not promoting a particular policy agenda, but it is just sort of everyday sort of living, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a natural attraction within evangelicals to charismatic leaders, and I think that's something that may connect evangelicals on both sides of the Atlantic, here in Northern Ireland and in the States. We've certainly seen that here, and although maybe Trump's rhetoric isn't Christian in the traditional sense, I think there's a natural cultural attraction to a charismatic speaker and leader like Trump has shown himself to be over the course of his stay as president. So
he's almost like a preacher without a church, isn't he?
Yeah. I think it connects on a cultural level, maybe more so than a spiritual or religious level, but it's something that resonates with them.
So that's pretty much it for episode 2. We'll be back in part 3 to talk about where things go from here and what it all might mean. There are so many what ifs in this election, but one thing we will see is that the relationship between Ireland, North and South, and the US is a deeply embedded one. And one area where it will endure is in the field of education. For the final word in this section, therefore, we'll cross over to DC and hear from Trina Vargo, founder of the US-Ireland Alliance, and in charge of the Mitchell Scholars Program, which has brought many young US students to these shores.
Hi, my name is Trina Vargo, and I'm the founder and president of the US-Ireland Alliance. And I really wish I could be with you today, because this topic of the relationship is one that's incredibly important to me. And in fact, I've spent my entire career on it. I've just come out with this book, actually, within the last year called Shenanigans. It's all about the relationship. You can get it on Amazon. In a nutshell, I think U.S. interest in Ireland and Northern Ireland is declining. It has been since probably the 90s, if not earlier. I think that's for some of the reasons are for good reasons. Ireland and Northern Ireland are, first world countries. It's in the old days, I think Americans felt Ireland was poor and we needed to send our money. That's changed and is gone. With Northern Ireland, I think many of us who were involved in the peace process in the 1990s feel like our role actually achieve something, and that going forward, the bulk of the responsibility for the future on the island is with the people of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I believe the relationship is important and we're sustaining, and that there's a lot of good that can come from it. But I also believe that Northern Ireland and Ireland really need to step up, in the sense that if you take the American taxpayer, for example, spent over $500 million on the International Fund for Ireland, yet my organization, the US-Ireland Alliance, our George J. Mitchell Scholarship Program, is one of the most prestigious American scholarships to get American postgrads to go study in Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's good for the island of Ireland to have future American leaders connected to the island, and yet we don't get a penny of funding for that scholarship from Northern Ireland. So I think unless the relationship changes from one that used to be a sort of cap in hand kind of relationship to one that is much more of a partnership, I think, the interest in the U.S. will only continue to decline until, someday our relationship, I think, with the island will pretty much be like our relationship with Belgium.